I can have emotions, Aussie. You know that, right?
You can, sure.
Just because you're conflict avoidant doesn't mean I need to put my feelings to the side. I have feelings, I have needs.
Sure,
Are you even listening to what I'm saying? What do you have to say for yourself?
I'm actually going to go back out, okay?
Are you seriously abandoning me right now? Where are you going? Are you seriously going right now? I mean, it's fine. I'm not your boss. I can't tell you what to do. I'm not your parent. Why do you keep saying sure?
So I just finished the Queer Ultimatum show, and I know I'm late to the game, but I finally got to it, and it was mind-blowing. There was one triangle of people in particular, Mildred, Aussie, and Tiff, that kept making me reflect on the role of culture in couple conflict. If you don't know me, hi, I'm Dr. Anna Uden. I'm a postdoctoral therapist and author of The Curse in Their Veins. Also, before we get started, just a reminder that I'm actually doing a giveaway of my novel, The Curse in Their Veins. So if you want to participate in that, I will put the instructions in a pinned comment, and I will announce the winner of the giveaway in late December. I'm thinking December 21st, but I have to check the calendar. Let's get into it. Just a couple quick things. I will be using the events from the show as sort of a jumping off point, but I won't be speculating on the psychology of the actual people involved because frankly with reality TV, they are so edited and stitched together where the conversations are chopped up into oblivion to the point where sometimes I'm even like, what are these people talking about right now? And honestly, the producers have something to gain from showing a specific narrative, from making you think that one person is a villain and one person is all good and all that stuff. And please do not send any hate to the people in this. Like I said, it's just a jumping off point. I want to talk about the role of culture in couples more broadly, but there was a lot to explore there. Starting off with Mildred and Aussie. I had to give you a little skit of their interaction because I was talking to my friend Amira about this. Some of you have met her on the channel, and she was telling me that I do a really good Aussie accent impression, so I had to throw that on there. And honestly, I relate to Aussie in a lot of ways. I think the way that they don't want to engage when someone's being kind of escalating in a conflict is very relatable. So when I saw them just like putting on their shoes and dipping out, I said same. So I first started to notice some interesting interactions between Mildred and Aussie that morning when it looked like Mildred was up for a while sort of doing chores and Aussie was telling her how great she is for all the stuff that she'd accomplished. And Mildred at that point expressed some frustration with the chore inequality in their relationship, and then later in the show it seemed like they got into a squabble over getting ready for the party or something. And from what I saw, it kind of seemed like Mildred was trying to pick a fight and Aussie was trying to de-escalate. Of course, again, who knows, it could be chopped into oblivion. But what I found most interesting out of that conversation was when Aussie asked Mildred, why are you acting differently in front of the cameras to make me look bad? That was sort of the accusation that unleashed the whole fight, but I thought it was very, very interesting to note because oftentimes people will do that. They will act one way behind closed doors and then act a different way when there are people present, either to sort of shoot the other person's credibility, to make them seem unstable, or even to pretend like they're sweeter than they are behind closed doors. And then later, Mildred was waiting for Aussie to come home, wanted to hash it out. Aussie clearly did not wish to. Mildred was pushing the matter, and eventually Aussie literally ran away, which is what you saw in the skit. Then later in the show, we learned a little bit more about Aussie's childhood and their relational traumas from their family of origin, and it all made a lot of sense. Family of origin, cultural background, and why there was this clash in communication between Aussie and Mildred. Cannoli, can you relax? And then between Mildred and Tiff were definitely some more communication clashes, shall we say. And Mildred was mentioning that she's a Latina. That's just how Latinos communicate, by speaking over each other and interrupting each other. And I loved when Tiff said, respect has no race. And then obviously in the reunion, we got some more backstory on what happened in their relationship after the show ended, and I have no words. So here are some of the things that this whole fiasco had me reflecting on. The first one is really the importance of culture and how people choose to communicate with each other. Look, I'm not Latina myself, so I'm not going to make generalizations about how Latinas do or don't communicate. However, I do feel like I'm at liberty to speak about the fact that some cultures do have very volatile, direct, passionate communication styles as a Romanian person. So every time I meet someone, I tell them I'm Romanian and they tell me, oh, I knew a Romanian person before this. I usually ask them, oh, what was that person like? And the response is typically some form of, they're very direct. And that definitely rings true to my experience of Romanian culture communication as well. I grew up in a household where people did talk over each other, raise their voices, speak very passionately to each other, express frustration to each other. And in fact, I don't fit the typical Romanian person in terms of my communication style. And the reason for that is a lot of outsiders, when they first meet my family, they say, oh, I can see why you're so quiet now. The other people in your family talk so much, there's not a whole lot of room for you to talk. So although I can't speak for Latino culture, I can absolutely agree that some cultures tend to leave less space for others to talk than others, with exceptions, of course. You know, it's always going to be very heterogeneous when we're talking about millions or billions of people, so there are always going to be exceptions to the rule. However, there is a difference between a volatile communication style and a hostile communication style. Volatile people communicate in high intensity, high passion. They can raise their voice. They have a very open, free expression of emotion, including anger as well. But it's also accompanied by very positive affect moments. Affection, fondness, humor, celebration, and the expression of anger or frustration to the other person doesn't impede the ability to make up with them. You know, you could express, I'm angry with you right now. Take 5 minutes to hash it out and then afterwards hug and say, okay, I'm over it. I'm glad we hashed that out. Whereas a hostile communication style is characterized by verbal, emotional, or even physical abuse, contempt, showing that you don't respect the other person, lack of positive affect, not having too many moments of joy with each other, resentment rolling over, holding grudges for each other, where even in those moments that are supposed to be happy and affectionate, people with a hostile communication style have a hard time not letting the negative moments sort of trickle over. Couples with volatile communication styles often stay together. They can make the relationship work. But couples where one person has a hostile style or both people have a hostile style are very likely to break up and very likely to experience abuse. Also, it's not mandatory, but it is very helpful for people in couples to have complementary communication styles because it's going to be a whole lot more work if one person is a validator and one person is volatile, for instance. If you're interested in the 4 types of communication styles in couples, check out a video I did on this topic more in depth. The point I'm trying to make, though, is that cultures can certainly have a tendency for more volatile communication style, and Mildred is right in pointing that out. But if volatile communication style is really just a cover for hostile communication style or for abuse of any kind, that is absolutely not healthy and not normal. And to use culture as a justification for treating someone disrespectfully and not wanting to change your ways when they're expressing the way that your communication style is hurting them, that's just not okay. It's offensive to the hundreds of volatile communication cultures out there that don't devolve into abuse. And honestly, it was not very surprising to me to hear Mildred's admission in the reunion that she was violent against Tiff. There is no culture-based argument that can justify violence against another person. So that's one thing that we got to consider is, yes, some cultures have different communication styles overall. However, that doesn't mean that it's a justification for abusive communication. Something else that we need to consider is something called high context versus low context cultures. When Mildred and Aussie were struggling to communicate, Mildred seemed to suggest that Aussie's communication style is unhealthy. She was saying it's not healthy to be unable to express your resentment to someone. And this again seems like an area where culture is really important, specifically a concept called high context versus low context cultures. In high context cultures, communication is more indirect and nonverbal. It relies a lot on body language, on how things are being said and what's not being said. You kind of have to read between the lines. Now, low context cultures, communication is very direct, very verbal, kind of like I was describing Romanian culture. And in a culture that is low context, choose choosing not to say exactly what you mean, sort of beating around the bush, is considered a sign of untrustworthiness. Now, oftentimes, and of course, like I said, there are exceptions, East Asian cultures can be high context. Because those individuals often hold very collectivistic values, meaning they value the well-being of everyone in the system, not just their own comfort, they would rather keep the peace and not offend the other person. I mean, there's even a cultural syndrome in Japan called Taijin Kyofusho, which is all about fear of offending or embarrassing another person. So a high context communicator, they're still communicating. It's just not necessarily through what's being said alone. Personally, I do think that Aussie was trying to communicate in those moments when Mildred claimed that they were not. It's just that their way of communicating is not quite as in your face as a low context communicator. Imagine for a moment that I, as a therapist, am speaking to a client and I interpret something about their life. I say, hey, do you think this might be related to blank? High context communicator isn't going to flat out say, I disagree, or no, I don't think so, or I think you missed the mark with that one. Probably going to say something along the lines of, it could be, and change the subject, or I don't know, I have to think about that. And I, knowing that they're a high context communicator, would have to read between the lines and figure out, I probably didn't quite hit the mark with that one. It's up to the person who is hearing this communication to realize, oh, this person is from a culture or a family where it would never be considered okay to flat out tell me I'm wrong. The fact that they didn't vehemently agree with me just now, probably a sign that they're politely, indirectly disagreeing with me. Now, certain pockets of very individualistic American culture tend to really pathologize indirect communication, high context communication. If you're not flat out telling someone exactly what upset you in exactly the moment that it did, you might get accused of being passive aggressive or avoidant or immature or a whole host of other words. But people from low context cultures need to understand that it's not always inherently pathological. In some cultures, the onus is on you as the one receiving that communication to figure out what the person means. Likewise, it's up to people from high context cultures to remember that some people are just very direct. So don't take it to heart if they're telling you what they mean in a very straightforward manner. That's just the kind of culture they come from. There's no right or wrong way here. We just need to be sensitive to the norms of other cultures. To pathologize someone for not communicating in a way that's more or less direct than what we're used to is frankly very ethnocentric. It's giving my culture's way is the only right way to do things. Like I said, this does also tie into collectivistic versus individualistic cultures. Sometimes on these American reality TV shows, I'll be watching and I literally feel like people are talking in parallel to each other. It's this constant game of, you're not listening to me, well, you're not listening to me, where it's clear that neither party is really willing to engage with what the other is saying. They're both so focused on their individual needs that they just keep repeating it and not getting anywhere. Personally, I think that hyper-individualism and hyper-collectivism have their dangers. Anything taken to an extreme starts to become maladaptive. I believe that we need to hold both what's good for us and what's good for other people who are inherently in relationships to us that are going to affect us when we're making decisions. So just be mindful of how a person might be from a culture that lies somewhere on the individualism and collectivism spectrum that's a little bit different to you, and when they're communicating to you, that could also play a role in how you choose to communicate. You know, someone who's from a very, very collectivistic culture, for instance, if they're in an Uber and the heat is on super high and they're sweating in there, they might not tell the Uber driver, hey, could you turn off the heat? Because they would rather sweat it out, be uncomfortable for a little bit, and preserve the peace. And also something else that I was thinking about is that even spirituality plays a role in how people communicate. Like how Aussie was practicing like what looked like acceptance and non-attachment, how they kept repeating, you're right, all right, sure, okay. You know, like they were basically de-escalating the situation, which is great. You might think that Aussie didn't handle it well because they didn't really get at the core of the conflict. They didn't get a chance to hash it out with Mildred. Maybe that's true, but I think there's something to be said about certain spiritual beliefs value just accepting whatever comes your way and not fighting it. And I also thought it was interesting that Aussie needed to go meditate to regulate their emotions when their emotions were too overwhelming. So be mindful that even in interfaith couples, communication can look a little bit different. So how can intercultural couples hope to have constructive conflict then? If you're here watching this video because you want to know, you're from a different culture than your partner or your crush or whoever, and you want to know how to navigate those more difficult conflicts, how can you actually do that in a respectful and healthy way? I think it's actually just one thing. You have to allow the other person to communicate according to their cultural norms. Don't try to enforce your way on them. Don't try to pathologize their communication style unless it truly is veering into abuse, into that hostile communication style. If both of you can come together and say, I understand that you communicate differently than me. I'm not going to take it personally. I'm not going to try to change you. I'm going to continue to communicate what's authentic for me, and I'm going to let you do the same. Then both of you are free to be true to yourselves. But how does this actually look in practice? Because it sounds great in theory, but I'm imagining some of you are wondering, how do I implement that? Well, it could look like this. Let's say that you have a girlfriend named Juanita, and she's upset because you didn't wash the dishes like you said you would, and she starts to openly express this. And her volume's getting higher, and she's expressing anger on her face. In that moment, you could choose to not take it personally. You don't have to respond exactly like her either. You can in that moment say, I understand you're angry. Personally, I need 10 minutes to cool down right now. Could we debrief in 10 minutes and talk about this then? And if Juanita respects that as well, she's going to say, okay, I'm not going to take it personally that you need space right now. I'm also not feeling judged for my reaction. Sure, let's come back in 10 minutes then. And then you come together at the end of those 10 minutes. You've cooled down a little bit. Neither of you has taken the other person's style personally. You're not still harboring resentment for the fact that Juanita raised her voice when she was frustrated. She's not harboring resentment for the fact that you needed space and weren't ready to directly address the conflict. And then you can actually approach the conflict. And this piece is important because in any culture, if something is going to get resolved, it needs to get addressed at some point. When it gets addressed or how it gets addressed, there's some wiggle room to negotiate that with your partner. But at some point, you do have to face the music. The issue with Mildred wanting to confront Aussie the night that Aussie left, especially with someone like Aussie who seems like maybe more conflict avoidant or becomes flooded with emotions and struggles to regulate them, you need to be very mindful of timing. If the other person is not in a headspace to talk about it at that time, it can feel like they're being ambushed, that you're trying to force it in that moment. Instead, it might be more adaptive to ask them, when would be a good time for us to talk about this? It needs to be a neutral, good time for both parties, where both parties agree to it, and when that time comes around, both parties are still up for it. It's not okay to just spring it on someone when they're not prepared or when they're not feeling it. Timing of difficult discussions is really important. You know, like if you tell someone you're upset with them after they just got fired from work or got home from a difficult interaction with someone, it's very different than if you say, I have this thing I want to run by you. When would be a good time for me to bring it up? You can wait until they're in the right headspace to actually hear what you're saying. So I hope this was helpful in talking about the role of culture in couple conflict and some important keys for how to navigate those. If you yourself are in an intercultural or interfaith or inter-whatever couple, I'd actually love to hear how you navigate that down in the comments if you feel comfortable. Don't forget to participate in the book giveaway if that's something that you're wanting, and I'll see you soon. Hope you have a great day.